Alright guys, we're going to be stripping down this Mavic Air all the way to the bare chassis. Starting with a plastic razor blade. You can use a credit card or some other thin tool, but you just got to get underneath this top cover. There's a bunch of sort of like clips that hold it in, and just work your way around, take your time, and it'll eventually all pop off.
Okay. So there's the cover.
Next piece is going to be this silver trim, and it's similar. There's some clips underneath there, but there's also some double-sided tape. So same sort of thing, work your way around with something thin, just pry it up and it'll pop off.
Okay, that's that piece.
Okay, now there's actually 10 screws, all in that hold this kind of top cover on. So you just remove all those Phillips head screws. Now, to remove this cover, you still have to pry up. There's a couple of tabs. It's actually from the gimbal harness that are right here, kind of like over the top of that cover. So you just pry those up. Now we're going to take off these other sort of side plastic pieces that cover the screws that hold the front arms on. Double-sided tape again, along with the little clips. Pry those off. Okay, once we get those off, there's 2 screws on each side to remove. And these are kind of like little covers that they cover over kind of like where the arms mount in. These are like machine screws. They're a little different than the covers that were, or the screws that were in the top cover. The top cover was more of like a plastic screw, or wood screw type. And then these are all, everything else is going to be a machine screw from here on out. This is the rear door that covers the SD and the USB-C port. Just kind of falls off once you take off that top cover actually. So now we got some screws to remove that's holding down the core board. It's like the main board of the system. There's a few of these. Pull them all out, you'll see them there. We have to remove this, just the fan assembly from the top, in order to get to some wiring harnesses and other things that we need to disconnect.
These are much longer and more silver color.
Okay, two more screws. There's actually 2 on each side. Get really long in there.
So there's a few screws you'll see on this fan assembly itself. Pulling that out. There's a screw here for this. There's basically like a little cover for one of the wire connections, and once you pull this cover off, it's held on by a little bit of like a sticky insulation. There's just one screw in that cover. You take that off, and then you can pop the connector off. Just get underneath it with like a small flathead screwdriver. There's another screw holding down this fan assembly. Okay, once we do that, you can lift up the assembly a little bit and then get in there and pry off there's a couple connectors for the gimbal. Same sort of thing, small, thin, flat screwdriver. Pull those off. Pull off this rear copper looking shield here in the back. 2 screws there. And then there's actually a couple connectors here. You can just pull these off as well. Disconnects it from like the rear sensor and everything. Alright, now the core board, or main board if you will, is pretty much ready to come out. There was one connection still coming from going into this board, and it's underneath the fan assembly. So the fan assembly is kind of like stuck down with like an adhesive tape or something. So you just kind of slowly pry that back and out. And once it's loose, I didn't disconnect the ribbon cable that connected the fan to the main board. I probably could have done that. But you'll see that there's a antenna wire that comes in and actually routes across the main board this way all the way to the antenna connection, second antenna connection. So you're just going to pop that off. Pull that antenna wire out. And now that core board or main board, this is the main processor board. This is free from the unit. Okay, now on the front arms, on the top side here, there's 2 screws and sort of like a, I don't know, a triangular shaped little bracket, plastic bracket with a big pin in the center. So you remove these 2 screws, and then there's, on the other side, there's 1 screw, and that's because we already removed the screw when we took out the arm cover, and so you can see this angular bracket with this pin going through it is white on this side of the unit, the underneath side here. So once you pull pin out on both, that bracket and the pin kind of are stuck together. Once you pull these out on each side, the arm just slides out. You can see the arm is free. But we still have the wires that go from the motor in the arm to the ESC board, the speed controller board, which is still in the unit. So these are soldered onto the board, and you'll need to desolder them. There's also, what I'm doing here is I'm picking off, there's like a little bit of like a sealant. It's not really like a hot glue. It's got more of a foam insulation feel to it. But I'm just pulling this off of the board so that I can get at all the solder connections, because we're going to have to desolder not only the 3 wires per side for the motor arms, but what I'm doing here is in the front arms there's 3 wires for LEDs that are in the arms, and these are thinner wires, so we'll just desolder those. Desolder the motor wires. And now I can see the arm will actually come out with the motor. Alright, so we'll have to do the same for the rest. So I want to get this ESC control board out of here. So I'm just going to desolder all the rest of the connections. There's 18 solder points in total. There's 3 motor wire solder points per arm, and then there's another 3 solder points for the LEDs in the front arms only. There's only LEDs in the front arms. So after you unsolder all 18 of these connections, there's a couple of screws remaining that mount this speed controller board into the chassis. Pull those out. These screws had little washers underneath them as well. Part of the mounting brackets for the front arms, that's what I'm pulling out here. We had already removed those screws a while back in previous steps, but the actual wires for the arm itself kind of were in the way. So once you desolder them, you can actually get those little brackets out. A couple more screws on this speed controller board. The washers. And this board's ready to come out. That's the speed controller board. Now there's the rear infrared sensor or distance sensor. There's a couple screws there to remove, and then this that whole sensor assembly will come right out. It's actually hung up a little bit on the wires for the rear motors. So I guess if you remove those arms first, the rear arms first, this might just come out a little easier. But I was able to work around it, and once I just kind of cleared the wires, it came right out. So we're getting pretty close. These are those triangle brackets with the pin for the rears, so we just have to pull these out. When you loosen these, you'll notice they turn because they're spring loaded. And then just put you know, a flat screwdriver or something underneath and pull up, and they'll come out. There you go. One on each side. Okay, that's the pin for the other front arm. So now my second front arm can come out. A lot of stuff kind of getting held up on the gimbal assembly. In retrospect, I think I would take the gimbal assembly out sooner. Felt like I was working around it a little bit here. Okay, so to get this gimbal assembly out on the sides, there's basically like these little rubber, they're like rubber bands that help suspend the gimbal, and basically you just use a little screwdriver and poke them through the side of the chassis there, and it frees them up. 2 screws on the, there's like a arm, if you will, or a bracing. 2 screws in the center of that bracing that disconnects that. Once you disconnect those, basically the gimbal will fall right through. As you can see, so that's the whole gimbal assembly. And here's that bracket I was talking about. Just pulling that through from the underside. Okay, now we have the front sensor. And there's like a ribbon cable, you know, the wiring for this, that's got some adhesive on it, and it's stuck to the side of the chassis and routed, you know, up to the main board. So I was using the back of my X-Acto knife, not the sharp end, but the back end of the blade, just to kind of push in between the ribbon and the chassis to separate the glue without, you know, without damaging it. So you got to do that on both sides. And then this front distance sensor should come right out. It should lift right out of there. Okay, we're getting pretty close at this point. I need to remove these rear motor arms. To do that, there's 2 screws. These are actually Torx or star head. Some people call them star, but it's Torx heads. Everything else has been Phillips up to this point, so a little different there. Not sure why they chose to change the head of the screw at this point in the game. So yeah, fold them back in, and that reveals 2 more Torx head screws. And pull those. All right, these arms will pull out. And the only thing left on the chassis at this point is these 2, they're like arm mounts, if you will. They're right here. There's 4 screws, Phillips screws in each of them. So just back those out. So that's it. We're, after removing this, we've stripped this air down to just the bare chassis. That's it. I'm going to replace this shell because I had a bit of a crash and cracked a piece of it. So that's the whole point of this here. Thanks, guys. Hope you learned something. Hope this was helpful.